We are so glad that you've joined us for this week's message from Anchor Chapel in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Our hope is that you're both encouraged and strengthened in your relationship with Jesus. Be blessed as you listen to this week's message.
Amen. So I don't know if you would agree with me on this or not. I would think that it'd be pretty obvious. But we live today in a culture that is very easily offended. Everywhere you turn, every post that you see, there are offended people. And especially in America, there are angry people. Everybody's angry, everybody's upset, everybody's offended about something. And it's amazing how this can happen. And it could be political, it could be religious, it could be anything. But people are just angry. They're upset. Everybody's offended about something. But as I look through Scripture, I don't see that as a characteristic of Christ. That you think about who Jesus was. He went to the cross, the ultimate example of someone who had the right to be offended by humanity, sinful humanity that God created to love him. We spat in his face and put him on the cross, and he still died for us. That's not an easily offended person. This is a God who is full of grace and mercy and endurance. He endures for us. So, man, I just noticed this in culture. We went to Disney this last week. We had our family vacation that we tried. When you're a pastor and you homeschool your kids, you get to take vacation at weird times. So, like, we had like a vacation week this week, and we go and we thought it was going to be empty. It was pretty packed, but we're out there at Magic Kingdom one day, and we visited this thing that we hadn't seen before called the Hall of Presidents. Now, we went into the Hall of Presidents, and it's really pretty amazing. And it's this great tribute to the presidents who have gone before us. And man, just such the amazing role of the American presidency. It's amazing. But I've heard some stories in the news lately about things that have happened at the Hall of Presidents. So when you're there at the end, they start to highlight some of the more recent presidents. And I've heard that when it gets to President Barack Obama, some people will cheer when other people in the crowd would start booing. And then when it gets to President Donald Trump, some people will cheer and other people will start booing. One man a couple of weeks ago stood up and started heckling him and talking about how he needs to be impeached and everything. And, I hear this and I'm like, okay, it's not a real person up there. They can't hear you. It's an animatronic wax figure. There's nothing going to happen. But I'm like, people are so offended. Like you can go and yell at a wax figure. That's how angry we are. That's how upset we are about just what's going on in our country. And you get so caught up in this. And I hear something like that. And I went in and I was thinking, man, I hope something like this doesn't happen. Well, actually, I kind of hope it does because I'm going to get on video. This would be crazy. But nothing like that happened. But I was like, you go into it just feeling the pressure of like any moment it could explode. You ever felt like that? Like you get on Facebook and you're like, what hit the fan today? Like, what happened? You check your news in the morning and you're like, what happened? Somebody's going to be mad about something and I'm going to have to figure out my response in 60 seconds. I'm going to have to come up with a well thought out opinion in 60 seconds, and I've got to choose the right side. It's just, we live in such an easily offended culture. I heard a story about a woman who went and bought a sandwich the other day in Australia. She gets her sandwich and she was upset because her sandwich was split not exactly down the middle, but on one side it was 5 centimeters and the other side was 6 centimeters. So she returned the sandwich and wanted to talk to the manager. The manager talked to her and he measured it out. He said, "You're absolutely right, woman. Here you can have another sandwich and you can cut it yourself." She cut it herself. The woman was 80 years old. An 80-year-old woman was so offended about her sandwich not being cut exactly in half that she wanted a new one. I'm like, what? Like, what kind of a world do we live in that it matters? We're finding something to get offended about all the time. There's always something to get all uptight about, to get your panties in a knot. That's what they used to say when I was growing up. My mom says, don't do that is what you're not supposed to do. But I think about what endurance is. And one of the church values of Anchor Chapel is that we're not an easily offended people. Because I don't think it's the heart of Christ. And what I want us to pick, when I think of endurance, I think of the bloody face of Rocky. And I think about, when you think of Rocky, you think and you watch the movies and you're like, this dude knows how to endure. Because he's taking a punch and he's taking another punch and he's down for the count and he stumbles back up and he gets back up and he starts knocking down Drago and he's like, how in the world did he do this? Because he's Rocky. And everybody, he's the hero. Actually, if you think of all superheroes, every hero, the way that every movie plot ever works, when there's a hero involved, is a hero has a rise, and you're like, you believe in him, but he meets the ultimate villain who beats him down for a moment. Every hero has to get beat down for a little bit so you can see the endurance in him. That's what we celebrate. We don't celebrate that he's invincible or that he's all-powerful. Even Superman, he's all-powerful, but if he never lost or he never got beat up, there was no kryptonite, you'd be like, well, anybody could do that from Krypton. But because he has a weakness and he endures, it's valuable. Because Rocky gets beat up, but he gets back up, then you cheer for him. See, there's an endurance in all of us that we want to celebrate. But here's the thing. I can't endure for you. I can endure as an example to you, but I can't endure for you. Because what God has given you, he's called you to endure. And there's a key element. You have to learn how to endure yourself. Nobody can do that for you. You have to learn endurance. So we're going to look at a story, a great man of God in the Bible. If you don't understand or know who Paul is, Paul wrote about 2/3 of the New Testament. And he was an apostle, and he started so many churches. God chose him, even though he was an enemy of the church. He oversaw murders and attacks and arrests on many Christians because he wasn't a follower of Christ. And God meets him on the Damascus Road. He goes blind. Jesus speaks to him directly. And then a man named Ananias comes and tends to him, and God speaks to him. You're going to be my apostle. You are the one I've chosen to spread the gospel at the beginning of the early church. So this is Paul. We're going to look at his story, and he's on one of his missionary journeys, and he's actually a prisoner at the time. And this is on the journey that he's on. It says this in Acts 27, verse 1. It says this, when the time came, we set sail for Rome. So he's on his way to Rome. He's always wanted to go to Rome, always wanted to bring the gospel there. Didn't think he'd be going this way, though. Then verse 4, it says, and they put out to sea from there. We encountered strong headwinds that made it difficult to keep the ship on course, so we sailed north of Cyprus between the island and the mainland. Then verse 14, let's jump to there. But the weather changed abruptly, and a wind of typhoon strength called a northeaster, y'all remember a couple weeks ago they had that blizzard in the northeast called the bomb cyclone? I'm like, bro, that sounds bad. That's it. But this is what they got something called the northeaster. They had a name for it, so it was bad. It burst across the island and blew us out to sea. There in verse 20, it says, a terrible storm raged for many days. Look at the picture. Blotting out the suns and the stars until at last all hope was gone. And what's crazy about this picture is that you hear of something like this and you can picture it in the context of a movie. You're in a theater, so you can imagine right now sitting down and watching something like this on screen. And you're like, oh, they're not going to make it. They're not going to make it. The waves are 4 times as big as the boat. They're not going to make it. But there's one guy on the boat that you're rooting for, and you're like, there's got to be a reason that I'm watching this movie. There's no way they all die. Hopefully, somebody makes it out of this thing. So you're reading this story, and you're like, all hope is gone. The storm is so bad, it blotted out the stars. This is how bad the storm is. But there's somebody on the boat that matters to God. And what I want you to understand today, there are going to be moments in your life when you feel like you're on a ship just like Paul. And it's going to feel like, I love the picture, that all the stars are blotted out, and it felt like until at last, all hope was gone. Have you ever felt like you're on a ship and everything gets so bad that all hope is gone? There is no way that God would accomplish what he promised me all those years ago. There's no way that this thing will come to pass. There's no way that I will ever get out of this hole that I've dug myself in. There's no way that this relationship can ever be, my marriage can ever be restored. There's no way that I could ever get a better job or ever have enough money for, if you go through Financial Peace University, you will have enough money. But there's no way that I could see the end of this or the promise of this coming to pass because all hope is gone. This is where many of us find ourselves in life. It's in different seasons. You feel discouraged and distraught and beat up until all hope is gone. This is the picture. And the amazing thing is, Paul was doing exactly what God asked him to do. Paul wasn't in disobedience. Paul wasn't doing what God had. Paul wasn't in rebellion. Paul wasn't running from God like Jonah, but he was in obedience. And he still was in the storm. And many of us judge our life and we judge the stuff we're in, and we think if we had trouble, then we must have done something wrong. Maybe sometimes the storm you're in is exactly where you need to be. And right now in this story, you can't see it. You can't see it yet. In chapter 27, it doesn't make any sense. Why would I be in the storm? But it will later. It will later. And our perspective has everything to do with how well we can endure. Now, I want us to understand there's just a couple things I want you to remember today. Even when we can't see the Creator sees us. So it looks like all hope was gone. The stars are blotted out. We cannot see heaven. God must have left. God must have forgotten me. But the cloud cover does not block God's view of us. He's always got his eye on you. He's always watching over you. He's always protecting you. He's always planning and preparing your next step for you. But we've got to learn how to endure right now in this moment. I remember years ago, my first ministry job, it was really one of the first moments where I really had to learn to endure on my own. You know, Brooke and I joined a small church. We just connected at the small church. The first Sunday we were there, the youth pastor had just gotten in trouble. He got kicked out of the youth ministry, and we just were coming to check it out. We weren't even interested. I mean, the church had red carpet. We were like, we can't be in a place where red carpet and pews. Like, we ain't coming to this kind of church. You been in that kind of church? No, we were in this church, and we were like, we just can't be here. We're just checking it out. We won't be back. But the Sunday we go, a need opened up. And we weren't looking for anything. We were just looking to follow God. We find ourselves in this church, and we said, well, let's give it another week. And let's give it another week. And eventually, this give it another week we became full-time youth pastors, media director, worship pastor, all this stuff at this church. It was just like God just began to open up and give us these opportunities. Well, the church that we had grown up in, that I had grown up in, was my home church. My youth pastor had built us up there. We were just an incredible church. They had wanted us to go and be a part of their church. They wanted us to go. Their youth ministry was failing, and they wanted some help, and they asked us to go back home to this church. And I remember being on a mission trip in Mexico and thinking, this is a really difficult decision. So God, I pray that you would make it very clear to me about what to do. So I got back and I'm praying about this, and I talked to the pastor of the church that we're at, and I said, listen, I haven't made a decision or anything, but I just want you to know that my home church called me, and they want me to go and be their youth pastor, and I just want you to know I'm praying about it. I don't know what to do. What do you think? What's your opinion? And this is what he said to me. He said, pack your bags and be gone by morning. And he looked at me and thought that just me praying and thinking about what God would maybe have for me next was being a traitor to their church. And he called my pastor that I grew up with, and he chewed him out, all this stuff. And he told that pastor, he said, I made Josh who he is. You can't steal him. I've been having him the last 4 years. And my pastor told him, I had him for the first 18 years. So who are you? And I was like, well, go ahead. So we ended up, but in that moment, I remember thinking, God, I'm just trying to follow you. I'm just trying to see what's next. I don't know what to do. I'm young. I don't know how to make a decision. But Lord, I need your wisdom. Would you make it clear to me? And that was my heart crying. I wasn't going to leave if God didn't want me to leave. I wasn't going to stay if God didn't want me to stay. I was just going to do whatever he wanted. But my prayer was clearly answered. But I will tell you, that moment when that pastor caused us to leave, we weren't even allowed to go to youth ministry night ever again. Like, we couldn't tell the students goodbye. He told me to write them a letter, and I heard he read it sarcastically. And, we had students call us up and were like, what happened? Why are you leaving us? And without staining the reputation of the church, we just had to explain, we just feel God's calling us somewhere else. It was so messy and so hurtful. And it wasn't something we wanted to happen. But I remember for months, we had a 3-month window before we knew at all if we were going to end up in ministry at the next church or not. We didn't know what was going on. And I remember I went back to building houses, and I'm working, and I'm like, God, if this is what you have for me, I'll do this. But I thought you'd call me to something. And I remember just feeling so heartbroken. And in that season, I was like, how could something like this happen to people who are we're trying to serve you. We're trying to honor you. We're trying to give you our life here. And I'm in the most pain I've ever been in. I remember just crying about it. I was just like, this is heartbreaking to me. That you would feel this. And I just remember thinking, if this is what ministry is, I don't really need it. I don't want it. I don't need all this. But God renewed our vision. And he renewed our excitement. And we got a call 3 months later. And I got lunch with that pastor, my pastor, Renee, and he called and he said, hey, can you do the job? I was like, I think I can. If you believe in me, I can do it. I can do anything. And he's like, you've got it. And we stayed there for the next 6.5 years until God called us to plant this church. But I remember in that season feeling like I was on a shipwreck. And like, God, I don't know what's next. But I was starting to get frustrated and almost frustrated with God. God, I'm trying to do something for you. Why are you doing this to me? And if you're not careful, we can let our frustration with life get pointed at God. And if you don't learn how to endure at all, then you're going to end up reaching a ceiling where the enemy is God. Because he's the ultimate one in power. So ultimately, you're going to be upset with him. And that's not a good place to be. But I love what Paul's perspective is. If we continue in the story and we find out what happens, Paul understood something that we need to learn today. Paul was in a shipwreck, which kind of you consider maybe a valley in your life, okay? So there's going to be moments when there's like some real highs. And there's going to be moments where there's some lows and they stink. They're not fun. But in the valleys, I've heard this quote, this is so beautiful. In the valleys is where you find the greenest grass. And it's the moments when you see fruit. And it's the moments when you're equipped and you're strengthened to hit the next mountain. So there's got to be valleys in our life. They're necessary. This is what Paul says. He says all hope was gone. This is the picture of the shipwreck. But then he says this in verse 22. But take courage. None of you will lose your lives, even though the ship will go down. He said, it's going to continue to get bad, but you won't lose your lives. For the last night, an angel of God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me, he said, don't be afraid, Paul, for you will surely stand trial before Caesar. And what's more, God in his goodness has granted safety to everyone sailing with you. So take courage, for I believe God. Isn't it amazing that Paul's faith in God was enough to strengthen those around him? So his endurance helped others to think we can endure too. That's why we've got to be people of endurance. If nobody can make it, nobody thinks they can make it. But if you can make it, somebody who's watching you is thinking, I can make it too. You've got to learn to endure. What's more, he says, God in his goodness has granted safety to everyone sailing with you. Take courage, for I believe God. It will be just as he said, but we will be shipwrecked on an island. It is going to be bad, but we're going to make it. We are going to make it. It's not going to look good right now, but I love Paul's perspective. Your ability to have the right perspective is what you need to have endurance. You've got to have the right perspective. While we're in Disney one day, while I was waiting for Brooke to get these amazing chicken waffles that I wish I could figure out the recipe for and bring home to me because I finished fasting now. So, I'd love to have that recipe. And so we're out there one day, and Judah and I are sitting at the table holding our spot, and I see the janitor walk up, and the janitor, his name was Leonard. Leonard, when I say it like that, because that's kind of how he talked. So Leonard comes up, and I was like, hey, Leonard, how's your day going, man? I start talking to him, and just like, he's got his head down, looked discouraged. I'm like, man, this is the happiest place on earth. And he's got his head down, and I'm like, Leonard, how's your day going, man? I mean, isn't it a beautiful day? Because it was like high of 62 that day. It was gorgeous. And he says, oh, it's okay. And he's sweeping around, and he's like, it was kind of cold this morning. And he's sweeping. I'm like, dude, I could be here all day long. Like, I know you're working, okay? I understand that. But you're working at Disney World. Like, it's still pretty amazing. Like, you look out, like he's sweeping, and the castle's right there. I'm like, this is still pretty cool. And he's like, I don't know. It's cold today. And I was just like, isn't it funny, though, how, like, your perspective about something can completely change your experience? I was having an incredible experience because of the perspective I had. But his perspective, I don't know his life. I don't know what he's been dealing with. Maybe he's had some heavier things that he brought into the park that day. It wasn't related to his job or whatever. I don't know, but it was just funny how two people can have the same exact experience, be in the same place, be on the same ship about to go down, and have different perspectives. And I think what God's calling us to is to have a perspective of endurance, that I trust God. God's not as impressed with your ability to stay afloat. He's impressed with your ability to trust him when the boat's going down. This is what endurance is made out of. Endurance is really trust. That's really what it's all about. And I think that if you're not careful, many of us, and I think the reason that many of us are so offended today is because we're so entitled. We have this entitled attitude where I deserve something, somebody owes me something. Well, if you're entitled, eventually you're going to run into God. And you're going to be angry with God. Entitled people get mad at God. This is what ends up happening. And we've got to be people who understand and appreciate the grace and the mercy of God that, hey, if I'm in a shipwreck, God, you called me to be here for some reason. I'm going to have joy. I don't know how it's going to happen, but I just trust you. I believe you. It's about to go down, but you know what? I was a little hot anyway. The water's going to feel great. So you just got this attitude where I can endure because I trust God. Acts 28. Let's jump to Acts 28. In verse 1, Paul understood God's goodness was constant. Even in a shipwreck, God's goodness was constant. So even in the marital stress, or even in the sinful struggle that you've been facing, even in the job stress that you feel, even in the problem with your kids, God's goodness is constant. He's always constant. This is what Paul understood. Verse 1, he says, when we were safe on shore, we learned that we were on the island of Malta, and the people of the island were very kind to us. It was cold and rainy, so not only did the shipwreck, but it's cold and rainy now. So they built a fire on the shore and welcomed us. As Paul gathered an armful of sticks, he was laying them on the fire. A poisonous snake driven out by the heat bit him on the hand. Man, it keeps getting worse for him, right? This is a bad day. The people of the island saw it hanging from his hand and said to each other, a murderer, no doubt. Though he escaped the sea, justice will not permit him to live. But Paul shook off the snake into the fire, and he wrote the song that Taylor Swift made famous. and he was unharmed. Verse 6, the people waited on him to swell up and suddenly drop dead. But they had waited a long time. They saw that he wasn't harmed, so they changed their minds and decided he was a god. Aren't people fickle like that? Isn't it funny? You could be like destined for doom, and people are like, oh, he deserves it. And something good happens, and be like, man, how do I follow him on Instagram? Like, it's just like the greatest person all of a sudden. A murderer, no doubt. You know what's amazing about this story and where this thing progresses? When the people started saying a murderer, no doubt, I'm certain that Paul was reminded by the enemy of the truth of his past, because he was a murderer. He had killed Christians. He had done all the things to deserve a shipwreck and deserve a snake bite and deserve a cold and rainy night. He had done the things to deserve it, but God wasn't going to let him pay for it. And he trusted God. So even though the snake came out, and I just want you to think about this snake to me clearly represents your accuser. The Bible says that you have an accuser, Satan. He is out to accuse you, and if he can do anything, he wants to discourage you. He wants to remind you of your past. He wants you to think, because of all the things I have done, this is why I'm in a shipwreck right now, and God cannot accomplish anything that he's promised me because I already screwed it up. This is what he wants to do. So the accuser is speaking to Paul right now, and Paul is center stage, because isn't it amazing that in the moment the accuser waited for there to be a crowd of people there. Crowd of people there, the fire comes up, oh, finally, we're going to get warm. Everybody gets around. All of a sudden, Paul gets bit by this snake, and everybody's saying, this guy must be a murderer. Because the enemy understood that if he can embarrass him and make him fall in front of all kinds of other people, he would have a harder time getting up. And many of you have had a public fall. And many of you have had things happen in front of people that you love. And many of you have been embarrassed, and because of your embarrassment and shame, you feel like you can't get back up. But that's only the accuser speaking to you. It's not the truth. Because even though what the enemy had said to Paul, this is amazing, it's not true anymore. What the enemy tells you can be true, but in Jesus, it doesn't make it you. It doesn't make it you, because Jesus has made a brand new way. Do you know that the island of Malta has no snakes indigenous to the island? No snakes on Malta. There are no snakes to this day. There weren't any snakes ever discovered. There's no snake skeletons found on the island. What I believe happened is that the accuser in the form of a snake followed him on that boat. And he came from his past. And whenever it says that they gathered shipwreck parts from the boat, I think the snake made it to the island just like they all did. And the accuser followed him from his past until the moment was right. The accuser is going to follow you all the days of your life, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But you've got to trust God even in it. Because even in it, in Jesus, what the enemy says and what the accuser says about you, it's not even true. This is just such a beautiful and powerful picture for us. I believe that your ability to shake the past off is what your future depends on. Your future, the dream that God's called you to accomplish, it depends on your ability to shake that snake of accusation off. If you can shake it off, if you can shake it off, you can endure. You can make it, but you've got to learn to shake it off. And here's why. Here's what Paul understood that we need to understand today. Paul understood that every accusation was already crucified on Jesus on the cross. There was no accusation that lasted past Calvary, and there's no accusation that can land on you today. Because in Jesus, everything was crucified to him, and then it was dead when he died. And when he was risen, you were given new life. There's no accusation that can follow you, nothing that can own you, nothing that can rename you. You have a brand new life in Jesus. It's all just about learning to trust him. And when you learn to trust him, you develop endurance. You can have the endurance that you need. Verse 7, let's look at this as the band comes up, and we'll get ready to close in a few minutes. I'll give you a chance to respond to this as well. In verse 7, it says this, near the shore where we landed. Did you love that? Paul said they landed. It's a shipwreck, bro. But his perspective, they landed. There was an estate belonging to Publius, the chief official of the island. Look at God beginning to orchestrate, and you begin to see how God was using the shipwreck and everything happened. They land by the boss. They land by this estate belonging to Publius, the chief official of the island. He welcomed us. He treated us kindly for 3 days. As it happened, Publius' father was ill with fever and dysentery. Now, that's bad. Paul went in, he prayed for him and laid his hands on him, he healed him. And all the other sick people on the island came and they were healed. Not only did Paul not die from the snake, but everyone was healed through him. Look at what the enemy intended to do, bring him down by sickness. God did the exact opposite. And instead of bringing sickness, he brought healing through this man. This is a man who had complete confidence in God. Verse 9, then all the other sick people on the island came and they were healed. And in verse 10, as a result, we were showered with honors. And when it came time to sail, people supplied us with everything we would need for the trip. So they had a shipwreck, but the shipwreck was not the end. And many of us today, you're on a shipwreck and you're looking up and the stars are blotted out and all hope is gone and you think, certainly this is the end. There's no way that my story continues after this. After what I did, after this circumstance that I was born into or fell into, or this wrong influence that I let into my life, after this happened, there's no way that I'm going to make it out of this. But what I love that ends up happening is it was really just a detour. It was all part of the plan. And in the valley, in the shipwreck, Paul was getting what he needed. He was acquiring all these friendships and relationships that he had no idea would have the impact that it had. Because what happens in Malta, for the next 1,000 years, Malta became the first Christian nation. The whole nation of Malta became Christians. And not only that, but they developed a navy. And this naval force at Malta was positioned in such a way that for the next 1,000 years, it defended all the Christian churches and Christian cities that Paul had gone to and planted all these churches. The Turkish tried to come in and tried to fight and attack them, but Malta was always there. Malta was always there defending the people of God. God had a strategy that Paul didn't even see. And what I want us to understand today is that, yes, the dream that God has given you is important, but if your dream big enough, then what you do in this life lasts longer than you last. And this is what I love about Paul, is he just knew he was still a part of the puzzle. He was a part of God's body. He was a part of this plan. He wasn't the plan. He understood Jesus was the plan. But while I'm here, I'm going to make the most out of it. And I'm going to endure, because my endurance will encourage somebody else in 2018 sitting in a theater. They're going to hear my story, and my endurance will help them to endure. Your endurance today matters because people are watching. Your kids are going to hear about this. And would it be great if you could say, it felt like the ship was going down. Stars were blotted out. I couldn't see any hope for tomorrow. All hope was gone, but I endured. I kept going, and I trusted in God when I couldn't even hear his voice anymore. It didn't make any sense. I trusted in him. I endured, and because of that, my faith is stronger now. This fruit that I had no idea began to spring up, began to grow. People in my workplace, people in my family began to see how I endured, and they were curious. They began to ask me, and I began to talk to them about Jesus. And people that I had no idea would ever be interested or curious about Jesus began to ask me. And my life began to preach for itself because of the endurance that I had. God wants to use you, and he wants to use your story as not just to accomplish your dream. Your dream is important, but I pray to God that the dream that you have is bigger than you. I pray to God that the dream that you have is about his church globally, not just you. As we talked about a couple weeks ago, ambition can be such a fuzzy thing. It can be all about you, or it can be all about Christ. But when your ambition is an ambition that lifts up the name of Jesus, the enemy cannot keep you down. No snake can bite you. No accuser can pin anything on you that will hold you down. Instead, you become a victor because Jesus has already won all of it. I want to challenge you to something today. I don't know where you are in your life. I don't know what exactly you're dealing with, but I just want to challenge you today. You might feel like you're in pain. You might feel like there's something that you want to endure, but you don't think you can. Think about, there's so many women, young women in the church who have had babies, but I've never heard a young pregnant woman complain about the pregnancy and sickness and all that, and then when the baby finally came, say, it really wasn't worth it. All that trouble. I mean, he's cute and all, but come on, I mean, that was a lot of sickness. You never hear that. When the prize comes, when the baby comes, all the stuff fades away. All the pain, all the trouble, it all fades away. And I just want to challenge you today that there's a prize coming. There was a prize for those who endure. Paul even writes about this. He says, I have endured the race. I have fought the good fight. I have run the race. I've endured to the end. And he was faithful. And because of that, he challenges you to be faithful today as well. And ultimately, Jesus on the cross, he endured the cross for you so that you can endure as well.
Thank you for joining us for this week's message from Anchor Chapel. If you'd like to support the ministry of Anchor Chapel, you can do so on our website, anchorchapel.com. You can also follow us on all social media at Anchor Chapel. We'll see you next week.